It's September 13, 2021. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm aboard my 1936 wooden powerboat Tortuga. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on with Tortuga. As people who follow my channel know, I put the boat up for sale earlier in the summer, and so far I've had a grand total of one inquiry about the boat. So I'm not exactly being knocked over by people wanting to view the boat and make offers on it. So I'm going with the assumption that I'm probably going to have the boat next spring and put it in the water again. So what's in store for Tortuga for this winter and next spring? Now, we intend to haul Tortuga in about 2 weeks, plus or minus a day or two, basically the last week in September, and put the boat in storage for the winter. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that in addition to using the boat over the next 2 weeks, I have to winterize the systems, which is pretty straightforward. I need to winterize the head, which basically means I take the boat over and pump the holding tank out and then just put a gallon of non-toxic antifreeze through the head to get rid of any water in the plumbing. And I have to winterize the fresh water system on the boat, which means draining the water tank and the water heater, taking the water heater out of the plumbing line and running non-toxic antifreeze through the faucets. And that's basically it. And once the boat is hauled, I will also winterize the engine, which also takes a very little time. I'm just going to open the raw water strainer and pour non-toxic antifreeze into it with the seacock closed and fire the engine up and keep pouring non-toxic antifreeze in until I have antifreeze coming out of the exhaust at the transom. When that's done, shut the engine down. Now, before I do all that, I need to change the oil, and that's pretty much it. The boat will be winterized for another year. But what am I going to do this winter as far as boat projects are concerned? Going on the assumption that nobody's going to show up in the next 2 weeks or after the boat's hauled with a big pile of money to buy the boat, I'm going to be pretty confident that since the boat hasn't sold, that I will have it in the spring and will be launching it again. As I said when I announced that the boat was for sale, I'm not in a hurry to sell the boat. I'm just starting the process, and if it sells, it sells. If it doesn't, I'll keep using the boat. But anyway, assuming that it doesn't sell, I'm going to continue upgrading the boat. Now, as you may know, about a month ago, I upgraded my house batteries from lead acid to lithium iron phosphate, and I also installed a DC to DC charger to charge the house batteries when the engine is running without putting any stress on the alternator. And I have also installed a new solar vent in the head to keep the boat a little fresher when we're not on board. And those were the upgrades I did during the summer. But what about once the boat is out of the water? Well, I'm going to do the usual thorough inspection of the hull, in which I'm going to go around the hull and with a plastic mallet and tap on the planking about every 3 to 6 inches, the full length of every plank on the hull, looking for soft spots. And once I've done that, if I find any, and I'm hoping I don't this year, I will replace any bad wood and fare the replaced wood in and repaint. I also have a couple spots where I replaced planks over the last couple of years, and I was a little bit lazy and I didn't longboard sand the new planks. In other words, I didn't fare them into the curvature of the hull. And you can see pretty easily, if you know what to look for, where those planks are because of the unfairness of the hull at that area. And my intention is to longboard sand those areas and properly fare those planks into the hull so that they're completely invisible. And of course that will involve sanding all the paint off, and I will then have to repaint. So hopefully this fall I'll make any repairs that need to be done, and I will longboard sand previous repairs to get the hull nice and fair, and I will get at least 3 coats of paint on any areas where I sand the paint off or put new wood in. And I'm also, maybe a few days before we haul out, I'm going to sand off as much of the cabin house as I can to get it ready for varnish. And the reason to do that is it's a lot easier to sand the outside of the cabin house here when I can stand on the dock right next to it rather than work from a step ladder. So that something I'll probably do just before haul out if the weather permits. If it's rainy, I'm not going to be out there sanding. And I do have some other fairly big projects that I want to take on. So let's look at some of the boat and see exactly what those projects are. Now, the first significant project I have in mind is to replace the plywood here in the upper cabin below the windows. And what I want to do is replace that with wainscoting that I will paint and build panels out of tongue and groove Douglas fir wainscoting to replace this plywood, some of which is quite old, and make the boat look a little bit fancier than it does now with just pieces of plywood. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to strip the varnish off the cabinet doors, and I'll buy new hardware because the hardware there is a little corroded, and reinstall the cabinet doors after I stain the mahogany there to match the mahogany in the rest of the upper cabin. And I'll, of course, revarnish it. So that is the first big project will be to replace this plywood on both sides of the boat with wainscoting. And that should be pretty easy to do. I just have to buy the wainscoting, paint it whatever color I decide, and then install it. Now, the next project that I want to undertake is to do something about the contrast in the varnish on the aft settee and the rest of the cabin house. If you look, you can see that the settee is kind of reddish stain on the mahogany, and the upper part of the cabin house is more brown stain on the mahogany. So what I intend to do is strip the varnish off that settee and restain the wood to match the rest of the cabin house, and then varnish it again. And I'm going to switch from gloss varnish that it has now to satin varnish like the rest of the cabin house. I'm also going to do the same thing to a couple of the window frames in the aft doors on either side. Those are stained with red mahogany stain, and I'm going to switch it to the brown mahogany stain and refinish those. Now, up here at the forward end of the cabin house, I intend to do the same thing with the steering pedestal and the mahogany trim around the bridge deck. And although you can't see it, there's a piece of mahogany trim missing behind this door that has been missing ever since I got the boat that I intend to replace. So that is a fair amount of stripping, sanding, staining, and then revarnishing. Now let's go below and take a look at some of the things I intend to do below decks. You know, down here below decks, the first thing I want to do is replace the glass in this port light. that port light was leaking, and I tightened it down a little bit too much and cracked the glass. So I'm going to have to take that apart and put a new piece of glass in there. I have glass, I just have to get a glass cutter so I can cut a round piece out and somehow get that glass out and put the new glass in. So that's a pretty straightforward project. And the other thing I intend to do is completely repaint all of the painted wood down here in the lower cabin. This wood was painted back in 2010-2011 after I finished building this interior, but I haven't really touched it since, so I want to completely repaint it and get it all consistent in color and looking brand new. And I'm also going to repaint the cabin sole. I've done it a couple of times, but I can only do that in the fall because I use Benjamin Moore porch and deck enamel on that. My wife really doesn't like the smell of it, so I need the whole winter for the smell of new paint to dissipate on the cabin sole. So those are the main things I want to do down here. Now, that all represents a fair amount of work, and some of it may get deferred if it turns out I need to do more repairs on the hull than I anticipate. So far the hull looks pretty fair, and I don't think I'm going to have to do too much this year, but you know, when you sound the hull, you always find stuff that you weren't anticipating. But anyway, hopefully I will get all of this work done in the fall, and so that in the spring all I have to do is varnish the exterior mahogany, paint the hull, paint the foredeck, and paint the aft decks, and put a new coat of paint on the cabin top, and the boat will then be ready to go for the 2022 season. So anyway, that is what I plan for Tortuga over the winter. Now, of course, that could all be sidetracked and canceled if somebody shows up with a big wad of money and says, hey, sell me your boat. In which case I'd have to say, well, okay, and take the money and leave those projects to whoever buys the boat. So that's the situation with Tortuga for the winter of 2021-2022, and hopefully all that will happen and the boat will look much, much better in the spring. And I'll have people falling over themselves carrying huge bags of money as they come to make offers on Tortuga. Yeah, I believe that. Anyway, I hope that this gives you an idea of what my fall, winter, and spring are going to be like working here aboard Tortuga. And this, of course, is in addition to everything else I have to do in the fall, winter, and spring. But, you know, it'll keep me occupied a few hours a day, probably for most of the fall and a good deal of the spring. So, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this little update on my 1936 wooden powerboat Tortuga. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't, and you like my content, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel and even go so far as to click that notification bell so that you'll get a notification when my next exciting video is posted. Thanks again for watching.